So the quest for my ideal Les Paul continues. Thanks to everyone that's come along for the ride with me so far. In my last video, I compared my go-to Les Paul, the 2019 1959 60th anniversary reissue, with this recently acquired 2024 Murphy Lab light-aged 59 reissue. And thank you to everyone that shared their insight, passion, and experience with Les Pauls. It's been really helpful for me in terms of assessing what to do next. There's things I love about each of these guitars, but I believe there's a Les Paul out there that will tick all of the boxes for me. And so, sometimes things have a funny way of working out. I had uploaded that comparison video around noon last Sunday. By that afternoon, I had decided that I was going to go back out on the hunt for another Les Paul. And by dinner, this Murphy Lab Heavy aged in green lemon fade hit the market, and it ticks all the boxes for me visually. So I ordered it to check out whether or not it ticks the boxes sonically and feel-wise. So in this video, I'm going to share my first impressions of that guitar, along with some of the cool stuff I learned from you guys in the past video. I'll also talk about what I'm looking for in my ideal Les Paul and how this one is stacking up so far. And ultimately, I'll have to decide which of these three Les Pauls has to go. And lastly, I will include some playing in this video, but I will do a much more extensive demonstration of the heavy aged Murphy Lab in the next video, where I'll compare it head to head with the light aged Murphy Lab. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, let's get into it. So what am I looking for in my ideal Les Paul? Where I started out was thinking I want to find the Les Paul that has the perfect sound, the perfect look, and the perfect feel. However, after engaging with many of you in the last video, I started to realize that may be a very long journey. In particular, speaking with Francesco, he owns 14 custom shop Les Pauls, and he had shared that some of his favorite sounding ones are not his favorite looking ones. Some of the lightest ones are not the best sounding, and so on and so forth. So that really struck me and held a lot of weight, that it could be quite a difficult task to find a Les Paul that has the perfect sound, perfect feel, and perfect looks. And in addition to that, I started to realize I already own my Goldilocks Les Paul type guitar, so to speak, and that is my Gilliaran Bone 59. This guitar is an incredibly inspiring instrument. I love the sound, look, and feel of this guitar. And at the end of the day, it does tick all the boxes for me, despite not being an exact Les Paul. And so as I was thinking about the fact that it could be quite a long road to find the perfect Les Paul, and the reality that I've already found the perfect Les Paul type guitar for me, I realized what I was really looking for is the perfect looking Les Paul, one that ticks all the boxes of what I like aesthetically about the Les Paul design. And so sound is still very important to me, but I'm quite open to the particular voice of the guitar, and feel is still important as well. So my priority here is finding the best looking Les Paul that has an interesting sound that feels really good to play. And so with that said, I'm going to share some of my first impressions around how this particular Murphy Lab stacks up looks-wise, sound-wise, and feel-wise. So when it comes to the looks of my ideal Les Paul, there's four main criteria that I'm looking for: the figuring on the top, the color of the rosewood fingerboard, and the quality and degree of the aging. Now, of course, this is very subjective, but I'm hoping these criteria may be helpful for you to reference when you're on the hunt for your perfect looking Les Paul as well. So I think for me, the most important of these criteria is the figuring of the maple. And I think this for me is highly influenced by examples of actual 59 bursts I've seen over the years. And in particular, the one that really made an impression on me is this 59 burst featured on the cover of American Guitars. My father bought this book for me when I was a teenager, and it was the first photo of a 59 burst that I had seen up close. And this particular example, you can see some very distinct patterns. It has a wide ribbon style flame. It has a slight chevron pattern, and the flame is quite strong along the center seam. However, it's not perfect. You can see that there's some spots in the figuring where the flame disappears. And all in all, this is one of my favorite styles of figured maple. And so when I saw this example pop up online, I was immediately drawn to it because, as you can see, it has a wide ribbon flame. The flame is quite strong along the center seam. It's slightly chevroned and it's not perfect. You can see that the flame disappears. So it's not quite a monster top. And the flame actually disappears right around this spot here, which is very similar to the example on the cover of that book. So when I saw this top, I immediately fell in love with it. And as you could see in the unboxing at the beginning, how excited I was when I got to see the top in real life. And it was just perfect. And when it comes to cool looking figured maple, HK Guitar commented in the last video to check out the last burst ever made. And so I happened to notice that guitar is featured in Burst Believers 5. It's on page 138, the last burst ever made. Really unique and beautiful top on that one. So I'd be curious to know, what's your favorite style figuring on a Les Paul top? If there's a particular burst example in any of the Burst Believers books or Beauty of the Burst, let me know the page number or serial number. I'd be curious to check it out. The next criteria that's important to me is the color of the top. And when it comes to the Murphy Lab options, Green Lemon Fade is my favorite choice. And that's simply because I think it most closely resembles a faded out burst, more so than all the other colors sort of resemble their vintage counterparts. And while overall there's really no red left in this finish, there is this caramel. It has a slight greenish hint to it around the edges. And when it catches the light just right, it does add some nice contrast and gives the top some character. It's not as washed out as like a lemon drop. And it just has a certain aged hue to it that I really enjoy. So next criteria is fingerboard color. Overall, I prefer darker boards that are very consistent and uniform across the fingerboard. And when I saw this board, it's just jet black, consistently up and down the entire fingerboard, to the point that I almost wondered if Gibson was using any kind of dyeing. I don't believe they are, and I haven't heard anything, but if anyone has any information, do let me know. This board is just as dark as any Brazilian board guitars that I own, and just very beautiful. And so the last criteria is the aging, and that's on two fronts, the lacquer checking and then just the overall aging that's been done to the guitar in terms of dents or finish being removed, etc. And so Murphy Lab offers 4 levels of aging: ultra light aged, heavy aged, and ultra heavy aged. And it was easy for me to eliminate the ultras on both sides of the spectrum. The ultra light aged one didn't appeal to me because I did want some finish checking and a little bit of aging. And so it was just too minimal for me. And the ultra heavy aging didn't appeal to me because they really take a ton of finish off the back and they really beat those guitars up and they just look a little unnatural to me personally. And also one of my biggest pet peeves is when I accidentally put a ding on the back of the neck of my guitar and then I can just feel it every time I pass along it and it just sort of takes me out of the zone for a second. And the backs of the neck on some of those ultra heavy aged Murphy Labs just look real brutal. And so I just know personally for me that that wouldn't work. So I honed in on the light aged and the heavy aged options. And now, having had an example of each at home to get familiar with, I'll share some of my observations and preferences. And so both examples have a good amount of checking on the lacquer. And for me, it's really important that the checking looks natural. And that for me means that the lines are going horizontal and not going vertical. And also, I don't want the checking to have that broken mirror look either. And so both these examples, the checking is quite nice, and it meets those criteria. As you would expect, the heavy aged does have a higher degree of checking than the light aged. One of the other differences is with the hardware. You can see that the heavy aged is much more tarnished and the hardware has lost its shine. And another difference is that the heavy aged Gibson does start to add a lot more dinging and start taking some of the finish off in key spots, whereas on the light aged, there's far less of that. On the back of the neck of the light aged, there's no dings or finish removed at all. And whereas on the heavy aged, there are very minimal dings, which I was very pleased about. The other thing I did notice is that there's this wear pattern on one side of the neck. And every once in a while, I do feel that and notice it. I'm still getting used to it. But overall, I do like the back of this neck. It's quite smooth and there's nothing too distracting on the back. Another subtle difference is the plastics are a little more dirtied up on the heavy aged. They look pretty clean on the light aged. And then the last differences are up at the headstock. You can see the tuning keys are aged on the heavy and not so on the light aged. And you can also see the Les Paul silk screen has been almost nearly worn off on the heavy aged, where it's still fully intact on the light aged. And so one thing I did notice that was peculiar is that the lacquer on the light aged feels quite a bit different from the lacquer on the heavy aged. Now I assume they're the same formula, so that's what was a bit odd to me. They're both made in 2024 within actually the same month. So I don't believe they changed the formula, but I don't know for sure. But the main difference is the light age feels more hard and more glass-like, and I can feel the checking. On the heavy aged, it doesn't feel as hard and glass-like. It feels almost like there's the VOS treatment on it. It's a little more dull, a little less shiny. It's not sticky, it still has a great smooth feel, but it's not as glassy and smooth as the light aged. And when it comes to the checking, I can't feel the checking when I rub my hands over it. So it's almost like the checking is underneath somehow. I don't know if that's just the way the guitar checked or if there's indeed something different in terms of how they do the finishes. If anyone has any information or insight on that, let me know, I'd be interested. But all in all, I was very pleased with the aging on this particular guitar. It's everything I was looking for and just has a great overall cohesive look to it. And so when it comes to the sound of this particular Les Paul, my first impression is this is a Les Paul voiced unlike any that I've owned before. And so I'll get a bit more into that in a bit. But first I wanted to recap your observations in the last video comparing the non-Murphy Lab Les Paul to the Murphy Lab Light Aged. I heard from many different Les Paul owners, folks that own Epiphones, Murphy Labs, custom shops, conversions, replicas, even from a owner of an actual 1959 vintage burst. And opinions varied. You had a few different camps. You had folks that strongly preferred one or the other. And then you had a camp of folks that thought that there was definitely some distinctions, but quite subtle. And then there was a few folks that, you know, didn't really hear any differences at all. But by and large, most of you preferred the sound of the Murphy Lab. Some of the adjectives used to describe it had more harmonics, it was a bit more nuanced, it sounded a bit more vintage, maybe better for vintage rock, softer rock genres, whereas the non-Murphy Lab was a little bit brighter and more modern sounding. And I think both of them are more in the camp of a Telly on steroids type of voice, where in all three pickup positions, you had a lot of brightness, a lot of clarity, a lot of chirp, especially in the middle position. And I really love Les Pauls that have that kind of voice. But what I noticed right off the bat with this particular Les Paul is it didn't sound like the others. Off the bat, it was the loudest Les Paul I've ever played acoustically. And I noticed it has less of that Telly on steroids vibe, and it has a much thicker, warmer, sweeter type of voice. And it has a little bit more of that hollowed out mid-range kind of tone, especially in the neck pickup. And at first it caught me a little bit off guard, but I've actually really come to love the voice of this guitar. And it's quite different from any other guitar that I own. So far I'm really digging it. Be really curious to know, what are the different type of archetype Les Paul sounds that you've come to know, and which ones do you prefer? And so when it comes to the feel of the guitar, that's what drew me into the Murphy Lab in the first place. Their nitro formula is just harder, smoother, not as sticky, and it just feels great. And the rolled fingerboard edges as well give the guitar a great broken in feel. And so this example feels great as well. This one comes in at 8.8 pounds. I prefer my Les Pauls to come in under 9, so this ticks that box. Also feel-wise, this is one of those guitars that you can just feel it resonating against your chest. You feel the neck resonating. You feel the lower bout resonating. So that's something I look for in a great guitar, and this one does that in spades. In terms of the action, came in with quite a bit of relief in the neck, so I straightened that out, lowered the action a touch. The guitar plays and intonates and holds tuning perfectly. I experimented with raising the stop bar up a little bit to add a little bit of slinkiness, and the guitar lost a little something tone-wise, became a little duller, I found, and so I just brought it back down because the slight slinkiness I gained there wasn't worth what I lost in the voice of the guitar. Let me know what your experience has been with raising the stop tail up or down, if you find it makes any difference tonally or not. As I mentioned earlier, the lacquer on this particular example feels a little different than the lacquer on the light-aged example. And again, I don't know if that's due to some extra treatment that's done to the heavy-aged, or if that's just some natural variance in the process. And so somebody who's done 30 years of woodworking and is very experienced with working with finishes applied to woods had educated me a ton about all the variables that go into the finishing process, from the types of woods and how they soak in the finish, to how it's sanded, to the amount of solids that are added to the nitro formula. He had mentioned it's 50% science, 50% art, so it's pretty mind-blowing to read all about that. If you're interested in that stuff, it's a pinned comment in the last video. But perhaps there's just a little bit of art and science in these finishes, and they vary a little bit example to example. So for any of you that have played many examples of these, have you found the nitro finish to feel similar across the different examples you've played, or have you noticed some variations? And I'm not talking about the aging in particular, but just the feel of the lacquer in general. I'd be curious to know what your experience has been. And so while I've broken down this Les Paul into various criteria, at the end of the day, it's a whole instrument. And I think it's really important to just sit back and ask yourself, does this guitar make me want to play more? Does it inspire me to get better? Does it inspire me to write new music? And my first impression of this heavy-aged Murphy Lab is it's certainly ticking those boxes. Here's an example of the first piece of music that sort of poured out of this guitar when I was testing it out for the first time in the basement. Let's check it out. And so overall, my first impressions of this heavy-aged Murphy Lab Les Paul are quite favorable. I think Gibson knocked it out of the park looks-wise. It's got this beautiful old-looking figured maple top. Color's perfect. The aging is quite authentic, not overboard. It's got a beautiful dark rosewood fingerboard. And when I see this guitar, it just conjures up all those feelings of when I fell in love with the vintage Burst as a teenager. And so that was my priority, finding a Burst that really feels like it's mine, and that has certainly been fulfilled with this guitar in the looks department. When it comes to the feel, I'm also satisfied overall with the feel. I'm happy with the weight. The playability is fantastic, and while the lacquer caught me a little bit off guard because it didn't quite feel exactly like my light-aged example, which I really fell in love with the way that lacquer feels, this lacquer still feels quite a bit nicer to me than the typical VOS or gloss that Gibson uses in their other 1959 reissue lines. So all in all, feel of the guitar is also quite favorable. And then sonically, I was really surprised with the voice of this guitar. It's not the typical Telly on steroids thing, but it's something I think a little rarer and a little bit more unique, and something I don't have in my collection. So I'm still in the process of bonding with that and exploring that. And so first impressions favorable, but I want to dive much more into the sound in the next video, where I will be comparing the heavy-aged Murphy Lab with the light-aged example. And of course, you can't really compare two guitars. Every guitar is unique, so you have to judge it on its own merits. But I thought that would be an interesting comparison from the perspective of ultimately I need to decide which of my 3 Les Pauls at this point has to go. And so it'll be interesting to compare and contrast these examples to ultimately decide which one works best for me. I also think it'll be interesting to see the comparison of these 2 guitars that are the exact same specs in terms of materials, pickups, setups are exactly the same. They both have the Murphy Lab finish. The only difference, of course, is they're different pieces of wood and the degree of aging. So for me, it was quite mind-blowing how different they actually sound. I actually found that this light-age Murphy Lab sounded more similar to my non-Murphy Lab Les Paul than it does to this heavy-aged Murphy Lab Les Paul. And so if you're interested in that comparison and helping me decide which Les Paul to keep, stay tuned for that video. And then lastly, I'd really love to hear from you if there's any other key criteria you have when you're looking for your ideal Les Paul and what those are. I'd be very curious to know. In the meantime, take care and I will see you in the next video.